Hello guys, today I want to make a little bit different type of video which is very important for me. I want to share this information. So, I'm a Ukrainian citizen. I grew up in Western Ukraine in Lviv, then I lived for 6-7 years in Kiev, later I lived in New York City, and right now I'm spending time in Mexico and New York City as well. But my home country, my country that I really love, is Ukraine, and right now it is in war with Russian Federation. I spoke about this question with a lot of my close friends online here in Mexico, and it seems like a lot of people don't really have a good idea why it happened and what is actually happening right now. So this video is to answer a couple of questions, and maybe if it goes well and you want to hear more, I will continue that as a series of videos with answering next question about this. Unfortunately, I don't have a nice background with Ukrainian flag behind me, but I think I have an idea how to make a little poster right now. I think it's much better like this. Okay, so let's go to our first question. I will start with very basic things. I very often hear from people asking, isn't Ukraine and Russia actually the same thing? The short answer is obviously no. Ukraine has its own language, it has its own culture, it has its own history. We know who we are, and we know where we're going and which country we're building. Let's start this short history lesson with the date 482 CE. That was when the Kiev was established by three brothers, Kyshek and Horyv, and their sister Libit. So during that time there were a lot of tribes who were moving back and forth, fighting with each other, but finally later in 882 the Rus was created. Much later by historians it will be called Kiev Rus to distinguish it from kind of like a Moscow part, but we'll talk a little bit later about that. The original name is just Rus. In 980, Vladimir the Great became the ruler of the Rus, and a little bit later, in 988, he Christianized the whole Rus. Vladimir's coat of arms was trident, the same coat of arms right now Ukraine has. And his son, Yaroslav the Wise, who became the next ruler of Rus, also have the trident as his coat of arms. During the time of Yaroslav the Wise, Rus grew very big and has enormous territory. During that time, the Saint Sophia Cathedral was built, which is one of the most famous churches in Ukraine. Ukraine officially celebrated 1000th anniversary of this cathedral in 2011. So this is kind of architecture we still have, and you can still see when you visit Kiev. After Yaroslav, the new ruler was his son Vsevolod. After Vsevolod, the new ruler was his son Vladimir Monomach, and at that time the Rus started kind of declining a little bit. There were a lot of kind of districts and parts of Rus. There were a lot of sons. They were fighting who's going to be the next main ruler. So it kind of started falling apart a little bit from inside. So one of the Monomach sons, Yuri Dovgorukhy, went up north and created a city called Moscow. This is a very important moment here in history, because the Moscow was established in 1147, which is much later than Kiev was established. As you remember, the Kiev was established in 482. So imagine at the time when the Kiev was one of the most prominent European capitals with big architecture, the Greek architects were there building churches and other things. It was really one of the most dominated cities in the whole Europe. So when Rus was with the capital in Kiev, which was a central capital and cultural capital as well, at the time Moscow was just swamp and forest. Nothing to do there. Later on the territory of Rus, the Golden Horde came and conquered all of the lands. Western part of modern Ukraine was under different rulings of Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Kingdom of Poland, Principality of Hungary. When Golden Horde moved away, the Moscow Principality, with the capital in Moscow, started to become bigger and started to control more land. they actually got mixed a little bit with Golden Horde, and they kind of had a lot of mix of nationalities up there at the time. But when you go back to the territory of Ukraine that was under Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, the people kind of stayed the same. They were just ruled by different kingdoms at the time, but they tried to keep the culture. We still had the Cyrillic alphabet. We were developing that, and we kind of were not really developing as a country because there were no kingdom or anything that we would have established our own government and country, but we still were passing the knowledge of our culture and language and everything that you kind of can give you to the next generation so they could know who they are and where they came from. Next part of Ukrainian history starts in 1482 when was the first written mention of Cossacks. Cossacks were the free Ukrainian people who ran away from slavery. I'm not sure if I can call it slavery. It's some type of like feudalism relationship where people were mostly working for their kind of local government in the town or in the village. They were going and working like on crops in fields with animals for like 5-6 days a week, and then they had time to work for themselves. Sometimes they were giving some part of crops back for them so they can feed themselves, but that was not always the case. It was practiced by Russian Empire that was on most like eastern part of the modern Ukraine, or in the western by Polish, Hungarian, and other kingdom and principalities. So I probably can call it slavery, but it's not exactly slavery. Also, the people were not really free because they were not allowed to leave their villages and places where they lived, and they actually were traded. So maybe slavery is kind of the word I can use here. But let's go back to the Cossacks themselves. So when those people were escaping from that, they were creating their kind of militia, and they had their own self-government and freedom. They were living in the place which they established, and it was called Zaporizhzhia Sich, and it was near the modern town Zaporizhzhia. Zaporizhzhia Sich rapidly grew in 15th century, and there were a lot of people who were running from Polish-Hungarian Commonwealth, and they were creating their own government, and the land was growing bigger and bigger. It became well-established and well-respected political self-government entity. In 1710, they wrote the first constitution. It was called the Constitution of Philip Orlik. It established the principles of the separation of powers in government between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Again, it was the first democratic society on the territory of modern Europe. 1710. The next constitutions that were written, they were French and Polish, they were written precisely 81 years later in 1791. So we can say again that Ukrainians at the time, because Cossacks were calling themselves Ukrainians and their coat of arms was also trident, were the first who created the true democratic society with the principle we all have today. During the course of 16th, 17th century and well into the 18th century, the Zaporizhzhia Cossacks were a strong political and military force that challenged the authority of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Tsardom of Russia, and the Crimea Khanate at the time as well. But unfortunately, in 1775, Zaporizhzhia Sich was conquered by Moscow, and some Cossacks moved to Dunai. They were called Zadunai Cossacks, but unfortunately they never had a big presence of military power, so that was a decline of this. Another try to build a new Ukraine was not successful. Let's move a little bit further to 1917, when the Russian Empire collapsed and there was a revolution by Bolsheviks and Red Army. They started conquering all of the territory of modern Russia and USSR. At that time, all the Ukrainian activists saw that this is a good idea and perfect timing to declare a Ukrainian People's Republic, which they did in 1917. Unfortunately, it only existed till 1920s, when the Red Army came back and conquered Ukraine, and then we got the history of the Soviet Republic of Ukraine in being in part of the USSR. That history is actually very sad. It goes all the way to the 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine declared the real true independence that it has to nowadays. But I will mention a couple of things that happened during the Ukraine was a part of USSR. The first, the most brutal thing that I need to mention was the Stalin's genocide of Ukrainians that was called Holodomor from 1932 to 1933, when he created actually the famine that was artificial. There were a lot of crops that year, everything was normal as every year, but everything was took away from people and people were dying from hunger. The estimated amount of people that died, the United Nations in their document when they declared that as a Ukrainian genocide, the amount of people that died that time was from 7 to 10 million people. During the 50s, 60s, 70s, and pretty much all of the time, the USSR, Stalin, and all the next rulers, they didn't want the nations to have their identity. So if you're doing something for your country, when you keep in traditions or something, you're going to be dead or you will go to concentration camp. So unfortunately, all of the intellectuals, and mostly it happened in the 60s, let's say you're an artist, you're a historian, you're a poet, when you do something to keep the traditions, to write, to sing, to do something for Ukraine, you would keep those traditions, they would kill you or they would put you in jail, concentration camps, gulag camps, all in Siberia. So basically they tried to kill everybody. So then you have the only one type of communist man. Also, all of the celebrations, the traditional Ukrainian celebrations, the traditional Christian celebrations that we had, the religion was prohibited, so there were no churches, like the building were still there, but this building would be the library, like Bolshevik library or something. There were no celebrations. If someone would notice that you would try to celebrate Christmas or Easter, you would be killed or you would go to concentration camps. So basically USSR tried to do everything they could to kill the Ukrainian culture. Not only Ukrainian culture, the other cultures of other republics as well, but Ukrainians were targeted the most because everybody know how Ukrainians loved freedom, that Ukrainians would never obey to all these rulings, so they had like Ukraine in a very harsh hand and they kept a good eye on Ukraine trying to break these people so they would forget their traditions. Why I'm telling you all of this history? That's to understand that sometimes if you would hear that people say, oh, like Republic of Russia and Ukraine, they're like brothers, they have common history. As you see, unfortunately, we don't have any good common history. The Russia always tried to conquer us. Russia never respected Ukraine. Like in Russia sometimes, even nowadays, which is disgusting, they would say, oh, Ukraine is our younger brother. Oh, hell no, Ukraine is not younger brother of Russia, and I wish Ukraine would never have anything to do with Russia, but yeah, we have this common history when Russia never respected the Ukrainian land and Ukrainian territory, sovereignty, nothing. And here we are, 2022, and Russia tries to conquer us again. We're a young nation. This is another try to have our own country, which we are successfully building. Yes, there are a lot of problems in Ukraine, but still, we're a young nation. We started only in 1991, and we are trying to build democratic society with democratic values. So I hope I answered you the question that Ukraine and Russia are different. We never been in peace and unity together. We unfortunately have the history of Russia trying to conquer us all the time, to kill our culture, and we are always fighting to that. So we cannot call each other brothers, we cannot be the same thing, we are totally different. We manage to preserve our culture, we keep developing our culture, and our culture is really different from Russian culture. Second question, why Russia attacked Ukraine? To answer this question, I have to go back to 2013. This is the year where at that time the president of Ukraine, who was Viktor Yanukovych, who was a pro-Russian president, he didn't want and refused to sign the deal to be a part of European Union. At that time the document was about European Association, to be like associate member with European Union, started a lot of good deals on trades, things like this. Our people really wanted that, But he sought a different way, and then he refused to sign that association agreement, and he wanted to sign another agreement with Russia. Again, here we need to go back how Ukraine and Russia are different, because Ukraine really wants to build a democratic society and be a part of European Union, Western world. And Russia wants to build kind of their own empire, when they're like centering in that empire with a couple of different republics back there around her, and kind of have the good deals for trades and everything, military deals for her. Which kind of sounds like back to USSR, which Ukraine would never want to do because we really suffered during that time. But again, Putin wanted to rebuild something like this. He had a very loyal pro-Russian president who wanted to go that direction. What happened next? I think you knew. We had a big revolution. It was a long revolution. Like towards the end of this revolution, there were a lot of sad events happening in the February of 2014. Our president fled the country, and we kind of won the revolution. We wanted to be within Europe. Our president went away. We thought, okay, we're gonna create a new government, we will vote for a new president, and we will keep going. But no, at that time, Russia used the situation that happened in Ukraine, and they annexed Crimea. Also, most of that time, the Russia invested a lot of money in their own propaganda in eastern Ukraine. There were predominantly Russian-speaking population, that the Western Ukraine, they are like very pro-Ukrainian, they hate you for speaking Russian, we need to save you, we need to help you, blah blah blah, all that Russian propaganda that I think we're going to talk in another video how it works, but just giving you like a short kind of understanding. They put a lot of money into those area of Donetsk and Lugansk. They created like their referendum that people don't want to be anymore with Ukraine, that put their own troops. They didn't put marking on their troops, but there was Russian troops, and they basically annexed also this part of the territory. But they said, oh no, there were like local separatists and they really wanted to be separate from Ukraine, so we just helped them. Yes, there were local separatists, but not without help of Russia. If there would be no Russia involved there would be no local separatists who wanted to have their own two republics that were Donetsk Republic, People's Republic, and Lugansk People's Republic, that in the whole world nobody recognized those countries. And so basically they were just like also kind of like annexed territory. We had a lot of fights. Technically speaking, we had a war with Russia since 2014 because they kind of quietly but then openly annexed Crimea, which is part of Ukraine, and then they also helped separatists to take that part of eastern Ukraine, which is Donetsk and Luhansk. All of the time we had some agreements with them. The famous one was the Minsk agreement to stop the fire, but that agreement was a big pressure for the president at the time, and unfortunately it was not a good agreement for Ukraine, but we had to do it. Our military was very weak back at that time, and we had no other choice. So Putin at the time stopped there. On this demarcation line, all the time there were conflicts. Even though there were like agreement to stop fire, they were still firing at us, and our Ukrainian soldiers were dying all the time. And since 2014 till before the big war started, like the open big war, there were like thousands of people died. Also, a lot of people flew from that territory to Kiev, to Western Ukraine, because they were running from this kind of oppressive regime, because you had to be only pro-Russian. If you are not pro-Russian, you were not allowed to protest, to say that you didn't like it. There was like authoritarian regime backed by Russia on those territories. And it stayed like that. They had their own passports. They were like sanctioned. They were not able to trade with anybody. They were trading mostly with Russia. They had some Russian money. They were backed with Russian army. That's how they were able to stay. And we never tried to conquer those territories back. We were just kind of having this problem and living aside with that problem. During all those years from 2014, Ukraine was in the direction of Western Europe. We wanted to become a member of European Union. We were talking maybe to become a NATO member, and we had our own direction and ideas where we wanted to go. But Putin didn't like it. He wanted Ukraine to be like a part of Russia, or at least very loyal to Russia, so the government is pro-Russian, because after 2014 we were thinking very negatively of Russia. All our presidents, there was the President Poroshenko and later the President Zelensky, they were not exactly pro-Russian and they didn't want to do anything with Russia. Putin was spending millions and millions of dollars in Ukraine to force propaganda against Ukrainian governments, against Ukraine itself, against the democratic values of Ukraine. In our parliament we had an opposition party called OPZZ, which was Russian-backed party. It was not very popular, but there were still people who were believing in some kind of propaganda. They were voting for those people in that party. So we kind of were fighting this like little Russian presence in Ukraine all of the time. Until one moment Putin really decided that he thought that he had so much dominance in that propaganda and so many pro-Russian people that he actually can start an invasion of Ukraine, and that will be backed by people, and he can overturn Ukrainian government, which actually he always said it was not legitimate government because the legitimate president ran to Russia. I mean Yanukovych, after the revolution that ended in February 2014. So, but no, we had our government. It was recognized by all of the Western countries, and we were pretty happy. Yeah, we had this frozen, not exactly frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine, but we were still developing as a country. Putin didn't really like this, and he decided, as he called it, to do the military operation of demilitarization and denazization of Ukraine, as he called it, because in his ill mind we are all Nazis in Ukraine and we are all doing genocide to Russian-speaking people. And with his military operation he tried actually to come into the country to save those people from this really bad government. That's his story. We know this story as an open war against Ukraine. How the world is helping Ukraine? We're getting military help, we're getting humanitarian help, we're getting political help. All world is actually in some way fighting with us against Russia. So United States, Canada, our European partners keep sending us military equipment, defense systems. A lot of countries are sending us humanitarian aid. Our biggest and closest friend, Poland, which is right next to the border, are taking millions of our refugees right now. They're doing a big help. They're right on the border, and we are very grateful to Poland and pretty much all Europe, all Northern America, and all over the world. There are a lot of Ukrainians around the world that are sending a lot of packages. They unite in the volunteer groups inside Ukraine, outside Ukraine. Whatever our army needs, volunteers trying to raise money and get it for the army and get it delivered. We have a lot of our Ukrainian army distribution centers where all of the goods come there and then they go to the front or whatever they are needed the most. So Ukraine is getting a lot of help, which is amazing. I'm also doing what I can on my side to help Ukraine. Part of that is actually doing this video explaining to you what is happening in Ukraine. I'm very proud that Ukrainians all around the world and in Ukraine united to fight our enemy. And if you're helping Ukraine, I'm very grateful to you too. Thank you so much and keep doing it. What the world is doing to stop Russian aggression and war in Ukraine. So United Nations, European Union, most of the countries in the world condemned the Russian actions and they ask Russia immediately to stop the war and take all of the troops out of Ukraine. Obviously, Russia doesn't listen to that and they do whatever they want to do. So one of the biggest things how the world try to stop Russia is to punish its economy. There are a lot of sanctions right now, and Russia has at this moment the biggest amount of sanctions in the world, even more than North Korea has. And they cannot trade. All international companies are going out. They cannot fly anywhere. The banks are cut from SWIFT system. Basically, it's going to be probably a Russian bankruptcy in like 1 month or less. So they are feeling the pain. And the people in Russia also starts feeling the pain when their currency went down, when all the prices went up. And, I think they're not going to be happy very soon about what's happening. There are more things that Ukraine wants the world to do, especially NATO. We are really asking NATO to close the sky above Ukraine, to help us to patrol the sky, because we don't have any. We have, but we cannot really cover our sky with our air defense system. We can do something, but we cannot close it completely. And this is the biggest thing that our president and other people around the world are asking NATO to do, and NATO still hesitates to do it. The fifth and the last question for today is, how can I help Ukraine? If you ask yourself this question, you're a great human being. Thank you so much. And right now I will tell you a couple of things that you can do to help Ukraine. First of all, you can share this information. You can join our protest. You've probably seen them. You've seen them happening in the big cities all around the world. Sometimes it happens on the main squares. Sometimes it happens in front of the Russian consulate. So just find the Ukrainian group in Facebook and you will definitely find where are the protests in your town. This is very important because we keep the pressure in society, we keep the pressure on politicians, we keep the pressure on big brands so they go out of Russia and don't do any business with Russia, which also punishes Russia financially. So please keep doing that if you're attending our protests. I attended when the war started. I was in New York City, so I attended the protests in New York City. Right now I'm in Mexico City, and I also attended most of the protests in Mexico City. Also, you will meet a lot of great educated people. You will have nice conversations and kind of a great time. You'll learn a little bit about the culture. This is amazing. Another way how you can help is actually donate money. We have a lot of volunteers who are all around the world organizing, and they're like collecting money. They sometimes collecting clothings, whatever. I think you're gonna find a lot of them online if you go. I will leave a couple of them that I donated, the people I know, the people I trust, and the people I know are helping. But there are like hundreds of these organizations right now. Everybody tries to do something. Everybody tries to raise money. Then everything will be shipped to Poland, and from Poland it goes through the border to Ukraine, because obviously right now there are no flights to Ukraine. So everything goes by planes to Poland, and then from Poland it goes to Ukraine. If you are still watching this video, it means that you're really interested in this topic, and I'm really grateful that you are still watching it. Thank you so much. Please leave me a comment below if you have any question about Ukraine. I will try to answer it to you the best of my knowledge. Maybe that's going to be the question of the next video of this series that I'm going to do. But for now, thank you very much. Please subscribe to my channel if you're not subscribed already. Share this among your friends. And into the next one. Slava Ukraini!